Alright, so it's the Free People's player's turn. The shadow player takes this dice, moves it off to the side to indicate that it's been used. By the way, when I have an option between these two dice to use, I'll use this one because this one has more options for me later on if I really need it. Alright, I'm going to use the Will of the West die, and I am going to bring in Gandalf the White. Very useful die. Very, very useful card. Alright, so to do this, I read Gandalf's card. This is in the rulebook, so I don't feel bad showing it to you. Alright, and you can download the rulebook from anywhere. Alright, so it says, if Gandalf the Grey is dead, which he is, or has left the Fellowship, also true, and any Sauron minion is in play, currently Saruman is in play, and for the purposes of summoning Gandalf the White, he is considered a Sauron minion. Alright, you can look it up in the facts. If I'm playing wrong, forgive me. I don't think I am, though. Alright, if those actions are satisfied, then use one Will of the West action die result. Alright, this one, to place Gandalf the White. Alright? To play Gandalf the White. Alright? So I take the Gandalf the White figure, or the Gandalf the Grey figure. They're both the same. This is the Gandalf the White card. Alright? And if he's on the map, I just replace him, but Gandalf is not on the map. Otherwise, place Gandalf the White in an Elven Stronghold or in Fangorn. Place the Gandalf the White counter under the Gandalf figure to show the replacement. I never do that because I always remember when I play Gandalf the White. It's very easy to remember and know. I just play him in Fangorn, alright? That's an advantageous spot for him to be. Fangorn is right there. I put Gandalf right there in Fangorn. You'll see why later. It's really cool, but that's what I did, alright? So that used my action die. That Will of the West die. Now it's the shadow player's turn to use their action die. Alright? And for the action die for the shadow player, he is going to do the Voice of Saruman ability. Alright? He is going to summon a single Isengard regular in every Isengard settlement. Alright? So I use that action die, pull it off to the side, go to the place wherever my army counters are set up. Alright? And I'm going to pull out 3 Isengard regulars. Alright? Place one there, and there, and there. Alright? So now that both players have used all their action dice, alright, we check for victory conditions. This is just something that happens, and here's how you check for the victory conditions. Alright? The first victory condition to check for is the Fellowship corrupted to 12 points of corruption? Alright? That's one thing you check for, alright? If at any time the Fellowship ever attains 12 points of corruption, then the game is over and the shadow player wins, alright? The second thing to check for is, did the ring make it to Mount Doom? Alright? This is why you play all of your action dice and you wait until the check results for victory conditions phase, alright? If the Fellowship made it to Mount Doom, the Crack of Doom, the 5th step on the Mordor track, we'll get to that a little bit later, then the Fellowship wins, or the Free People's player wins, alright? Just the way it works. The next thing we check for is, if that wasn't satisfied, is, does the shadow player some way, somehow have 10 points of victory point? Does the shadow player have 10 victory points some way, somehow comprised of strongholds and cities? No, he does not. Alright? Victory condition is not satisfied. Now we check for the Free People's military condition. Do they have 4 points worth of strongholds and or cities? No, they do not. Very hard to get. Alright? So now that that phase is over, we draw the event cards. But before we do that, let's talk a little bit about strategy again, alright? Alright, so first of all, think about victory conditions I just mentioned. When the player goes through the victory, when we go through the victory condition phase, or the victory check phase, we check for the victory conditions, alright? First thing to note, if at any time during the game, any time during anyone's turn, during anyone's use of an action die, that some way, somehow, the Fellowship gets 12 points of corruption, Frodo is dead and the Shadow player wins immediately, alright? Other than that, you wait until the check for victory conditions phase to see who won, alright? That's just how it works, alright? If Frodo does not have 12 points of victory, 12 points of corruption, then you go to check victory conditions phase, alright? You check to see if Frodo is on the Crack of Doom. Now remember how we talked about, the Fellowship uses their action dice to move the Fellowship. Fellowship player uses action dice to move the Fellowship, alright? So, as I mentioned before, we got the Fellowship, and they're trucking, they're going to be moving and going south and east at the same time until they get to Mordor. And then special things will happen once they get there, but basically they're going to move one step at a time on the Mordor track. And they're going to make it to the Crack of Doom using an action die. Most likely it'll be a character sword action die. Alright? It'll just happen. When they make it there, the game is not yet over, alright? The game does not end immediately when the ring is destroyed. It just doesn't happen. It ends when the victory conditions check thing is done, alright? So the Shadow player and the Free People's player would play to the end of the round, and they would see who won. Now, naturally, the Free People's player would win because that's a game winner. It takes precedence over the Shadow players get 10 points option. Alright? So the way I listed those victory conditions, one is to corrupt the Fellowship to 12 points of corruption. The second is to destroy the ring. The third is to get 10 points for the Shadow player. The fourth is to get 4 points for the Free People's player. Alright? That's the order of precedence for the victory conditions. If at any time 2 victory conditions are satisfied at the same time, you go by that order. The first one that is met is the first one that is named or listed is the winner. So for example, if the Shadow player and the Free People's player both attain their military victory conditions at the same time, you'd play to the end of the round to see what happens. Both players would use all their action dice, and then they would do the victory conditions check, and the Shadow player would win because having a Shadow victory takes precedence over having a Free People's military victory. Alright? Just some things to take note of as before we start the next turn. Alright, so it's time to draw event cards. Before we do that, we gather the dice. The Free People's player takes the 2 dice that he placed in the Shadow box back to his little pile. Remember that Gandalf the White came into play, so now the Free People's player has 5 action dice at their disposal. Very, very, very helpful and very important to get it early in the game. Alright? The Shadow player also takes their 8 dice and tries to figure out something to do with them. Alright? As the Shadow player, I know that the Fellowship is going to keep on moving, and I want to keep a good round number in there, so I'm going to put 3 eyeball dice in the Shadow box. Alright? Just something I'd like to do, and I'm still allowed to do that. Currently, there are 6 members in the Fellowship. Gollum does not count yet. He only counts as a member of the Fellowship when all other members have left. Alright? Now, just some things to keep in mind. Let me see where I am. Oh yeah, alright. So, now we would draw our event cards. Alright? So the Free People's player draws their 2 event cards, 1 strategy card, and 1 character card. And the Shadow player does the same. If you're following along at home, you're going to realize that I just broke a rule, or not a rule, the rule's not broken yet. The Free People's player has more than 6 cards in their hand, alright? The cards that he has are the House of the Stewards, the Spirit of Mordor, the Last Battle, Path of the Wozes, Mirror of Galadriel, Thranduil's Archers, and There and Back Again, alright? When a player, be it Free People's player or Shadow player, has more than 6 cards in their hand, this usually happens when they draw event cards, in fact it always does, they must immediately discard a card from their hand. So for example, I am the Free People's player, I am allowed to look at all 7 of the cards that I have in my hand, and I'm allowed to pick one, whatever one I want. I can pick any card and I can discard it. It would be the same as if I'd used the card, alright? So I'm going to pick The Last Battle, alright? That's a useless card for the first edition, alright? So I'm going to take the Last Battle card and I'm going to put it over here with the discard pile, alright? Just where I put it, alright? Doesn't make a difference. Alright, so some things to keep in mind, just some things about differences between the first and second editions, alright? One of the things that the playtesters did for the second edition was they reevaluated the first edition defaults. For example, in the first edition, you would be crazy not to kill off Gandalf immediately, alright? And you'd be crazy also, somewhat, not really crazy. It's a useful card. The Last Battle, the one I just discarded for first edition, it's useful, but it hardly ever comes up, alright? They made Gandalf the White and they made Gandalf the Grey in the second edition quite a bit more powerful, alright? You can read second edition rules, you can download them from the internet, wherever. Veldrin has a really cool site that has a whole bunch of downloads and facts, really helpful site. But you can go to that site and you can see the changes that were made, alright? Basic point being, the second edition is slightly more balanced, alright? In the first edition game, the Shadow player has a slight advantage, and I say slight very loosely. A slight advantage, a small advantage, very small advantage. For experienced players who know how to play the game, I think the advantage disappears. It's a very good game. It tells the story very well, in my opinion. It creates a bunch of what if this had happened, and for Tolkien fans and enthusiasts and fanatics, it's a very, very fun game. But just keep in mind, it's not completely balanced if you're playing first edition. It's slightly leaning towards the Shadow player for an advantage, but only slightly, alright? But we'll get into that later if you want. But for the time being, just note that Gandalf the Grey has slightly better abilities in the second edition than he does in the first, and the card The Last Battle is quite a bit more powerful. In fact, a lot more powerful in the second edition than in the first edition. Alright, with that being said, both characters drew their cards, alright? And, you know, now the Free People's player has 6 cards in their hand, Shadow player has 4. Now they both are going to roll their dice, alright? The Shadow player could have put more eyeball dice in the hunt box, but he also needs actions because he needs to get the rest of his army, the rest of his nations activated and at war. Not activated, just at war. And the Free People's player needs to get their nations at war. But keep in mind, we're only on the 3rd turn. Turns take a lot longer when you're doing a tutorial, alright? So we shake the dice. Alright? Alright, so we separate out the dice for the Fellowship and the dice for the Shadow player, keeping in mind that we take all dice with an I result and put them in the Shadow box. Alright, so it's the Free People's player's turn, alright, and as a general rule, just for myself, I like to try to move the Fellowship at least once every turn, generally, sometimes. Just something to follow for the beginning of the game, alright? So I take one of my character action die results, this one, and I move it off to the side. Same as before, as the Free People's player, I move this up one. The Shadow player is now going to roll however many dice he has eyeballs in the hunt box, alright, which is 4. So he rolls 4. And he had a 6, a 4, a 4, and a 2. So he got 1 success, alright? So one of the dice was a successful hunt. So he's going to randomly draw from the pouch. And the tile is an eyeball tile. Alright? So, as we've talked about before, that I means that the Free People's player must now take damage or corruption equal to the number of successful hits on the die roll. We remember that we got one successful hit, which was a 6. So the eyeball now has a damage of 1. And it reveals the Fellowship. Alright? So this opens the way for lots and lots of good rule going over stuff. Alright? So let's zoom over to the Fellowship and see how they're doing. First, we flip this over to Revealed. Alright? And then we move it down one. And now we want to move the Fellowship, one space from Holland. Alright? I'm going to go through a stronghold so you can see what happens when you do that. Alright? Alright? You might ask, why am I moving through Moria, first of all? Well, I could go through the Fords of Ruin, and then the High Pass, and then Goblin's Gate, and then the Old Ford, Gladden Fields, Dimril Dale, and then Lorien. But that takes a while, and I want to just take a shortcut. This is generally a good thing to do. Not always, but sometimes. Alright, so I moved through Moria, alright? Alright, so let's just stop a minute and talk about this for a minute. The Fellowship is currently revealed, and they just went into a Shadow Stronghold, alright? When that happens, the Shadow player immediately draws another hunt tile without rolling any dice. Now the reason is because the Fellowship is revealed and it just went into a Shadow Stronghold. The true wording on this rule is the following. When the Fellowship is revealed and its path traced from its last known position, if the Fellowship has moved through, is moving from, or is moving into a Shadow Stronghold, then a hunt tile is immediately drawn as if a hunt has been successful. This is done only if the Fellowship is revealed by the Shadow player, and it is in addition to any further effects of a successful hunt. Hunt tiles explain in more detail later. Alright? So it could have happened like this. I could have had more movement on the Fellowship track. I could have been revealed and thrown into Dimril Dale because I had 2 movement, 1, 2, if I would have been on 2. Alright? The Shadow player would still draw a hunt tile. Alright? The idea is that if you're revealed and you move into or you move through or you were moving out of a Shadow Stronghold, then he gets to draw a hunt tile. But generally that's a very bad thing to do. Not recommended to move in when you're revealed. Very bad. Wouldn't recommend it unless you absolutely had to. If I were playing this game for seriousness, I would probably go through North Dunland. Maybe. But Moria is a really nice shortcut. Alright? So the Shadow player goes to his pouch and draws out another random tile. It's another eye tile. Alright? So, just a second. Alright, so the tile that was drawn out of the hunt bag, just because the Fellowship moved through a Shadow Stronghold and was revealed, was an eye tile. Alright? When an eye tile is drawn in this fashion, where there was no roll, in a sense, then the eye tile is discarded and it is ignored. So that is a lucky break for the Free People's player. Alright? So just keep that in mind, alright? So when the Fellowship is revealed, alright, I probably said this once or twice, but it's important, and their path was traced and they went into a Shadow Stronghold, or they moved from a Shadow Stronghold, or moved through a Shadow Stronghold, and their path was traced in such a fashion, then a hunt tile is drawn. Alright? So, I could have been revealed in Dimril Dale, and that would have happened. Alright? Same thing would have happened. I would have drawn a tile just because they moved through a Shadow Stronghold. It's dangerous to move through Shadow Strongholds. Alright? So, it is now the Shadow player's turn. Alright? But before we get into that, alright, let's talk about separating companions from the Fellowship, alright? Eventually I'm going to want to do that. Not quite yet, but eventually. Really, really soon. Alright? So, say I had separated companions from the Fellowship in Holland, alright? And I know I've already talked about this before, but just so you can see it in action, if I had the Fellowship here, they're not here, they're in Moria. If I had them there, and I separated some number of companions, let's say I separated Strider and Boromir, alright? And I left everyone else in there. And I separated Strider and Boromir. Alright, so if I'd have used, like you know, if I was standing there in Holland and I'd have used this dice instead of moving the Fellowship with it, I decided to separate some number of companions, and I separate Strider and Aragorn. They are allowed to move a number of regions equal to their level, plus whatever step the Fellowship track is at, whatever step the Fellowship marker is on. So if the Fellowship marker over here was on, like you know, 3, and Aragorn is a level 3, then he could take himself and Boromir up to 6 spaces away from Holland, wherever. But part of the trick is that Aragorn, or Strider, and Boromir, if at any time characters are moving on the board, and you know they're the companion characters, and they go through a shadow stronghold, they must immediately end their movement in a shadow stronghold. They cannot move through it willy-nilly. Alright? So they would not be able to, like, you know, because the Fellowship track marker is on 0, they couldn't go, like, you know, 1, 2, 3. That wouldn't be permitted. They would go 1, and then I could use another dice, like this one down here, that I have already available on my next turn, and I could move them, you know, 1, 2, 3 from Moria. But I would not be able to move them through Moria. Every time a companion goes into a shadow stronghold, they must end their movement there, regardless of how much movement they had when they entered. Alright? But I didn't do that. I moved through Moria, and I'm revealed, and the shadow player drew an eye tile. That was pretty nice. That was quite lucky, in my opinion. Alright? So now it's the shadow player's turn to use one of his action dice. Alright? Alright, so currently the Fellowship is revealed, and as you know, I have the card Lure of the Ring. So I have the card, the Lure of the Ring, and I'm going to play the Lure of the Ring. And I'm going to use my Palantir dice to do that, my Palantir action dice. Oh yeah, and by the way, the dice that was used to move the Fellowship, just like before, same as always, it goes into the box. Alright? So I use the card. You can follow along at home. I'm just going to do it. If you have questions, go online and ask. But like before, I pay the price, which is the Palantir or a character sword icon. Doesn't really matter. And I stick it in the discard pile, and I do what it says. Flip these over so I can get one at random. Make sure that I'm not playing with Gandalf, because he's already out of the Fellowship. There he is. Alright, it's Strider. I'm definitely not going to kill him off. I'm just going to take corruption equal to his level. So I'm at 4 corruption. Alright, so 4 corruption. Alright, so that's how we got there. Alright, Free People's player's turn. Alright, currently the Fellowship is revealed. The Free People's player wants to avoid that as much as possible. Alright, so he uses his action dice, this one in particular, to hide the Fellowship. It does not go in the hump box, it just goes off to the side. And way up there in the corner, this goes to hidden. Alright? So you can see how we use the dice to move and hide the Fellowship. Alright? So now it's the Shadow player's turn. Alright? So the Shadow player wants to muster in a little bit more strength in Isengard. Alright? He cannot muster in units in any other nation because none of the other nations are at war. That's a key point to remember. To be able to muster in units for reinforcements, like I'm doing with Isengard, I could use muster dice, which I have too, you just saw them, I could muster in units with those 2 dice, but I want to use Saruman's ability because it's a really cool ability. Alright? But for the other nations that aren't at war, I cannot do that yet. And to get at war, they have to progress down the political track. Alright? Right over there. Currently, the elves are sitting right here. Right? Remember that. And the other Free Peoples nations are not yet activated. Alright? So I cannot yet muster any reinforcements from those, even though I have the piles set aside for those nations. So I'm just going to muster using the voice of Saruman, and I'm going to change 2 elites, 2 regulars in Isengard to 2 elites using the voice of Saruman with a muster die. Right there. Put it off to the side to show that it's been used. Alright, and I'm going to grab 2 elites from my available forces. Alright, 1 and 2. Alright, and I replace 2 regulars in Isengard with elites. Easy enough. Alright, that's simple. Alright, and the 2 regulars I just pulled, they go back into my available forces pile. Alright, so now it's the Free People's player's turn. Free People player's turn. Whatever. Alright, so if you're following along at home, I am going to use Thranduil's Archers. Alright, the cost to use this card is indicated right there. It's either a helmet icon action dice or a Palantir action dice, a muster die or an action die, or an event, or a Palantir die. Alright, so I'm going to use my Palantir die just because I want to. I could use the muster die, but I'm not going to. Just like before, I discard it over there, read the card to myself, and obey it. Alright. The new strategy card that I drew is Kindred of Glorfindel. And it goes right to my hand. Alright. And 1 unit over there, somewhere. Alright. So now it's the shadow player's turn. Alright, if you're following along at home, then you know that I have 2 regular Isengard units left. I mean 2 regulars and an elite left to muster. I don't really want to use those just yet. Instead, I'm going to use my muster die right here. And I'm going to put the Sauron nation to be at war. Alright? I use the muster ability of that of the double die, and I move the Sauron nation right here to be at war. Alright? Now the Sauron nation is at war. Alright? Now it's the Free People's player's turn. Alright? They have those 2 dice left, and just for kicks, they're gonna muster in the Elf nation. Alright? So the Elf nation can be at war. Alright? So that's how that works. Now both players have a character action die left. And let's check something. Alright, so both players have 1 turn each. The Free People's player has a character action die, and the Shadow player has their character action die. Free People's player goes first. Alright, so the Free People's player is going to use their character action die because, you know, they're looking over here at Isengard and going, oh, that's going to hurt if they come into the Fords of Isen. So the Free People's player uses their character action die to move leaders, alright? He can move 1 leader and whatever army units are touching that leader. So he takes all these people, all these units, and punches them into Helm's Deep, alright? That could be a good thing to do, could not be. We'll talk about it a little bit later, but I want to get Helm's Deep fortified, alright, before I do much else, alright? And you can only do that with 1 leader, alright? So that used up that character action die. Now it's the shadow player's turn, and he's going to go over here, and he's going to do the same thing. He's going to move an army with a leader. Alright? So he's going to move his little leader, this one, into Morannon along with 5 units, because it's just how I want to play. Alright? I could do 6, but then I would lose one by putting more than 10 units in Morannon. Alright? So I'm going to move the elite and 4 regulars into there. Alright? So now Morannon has 10 units in it. And now they can come out and start whooping butt at wherever I want them to. Alright? And these 5 figures right here, they're going to go into Minas Morgul, but I don't have an extra die for that to do that yet. So, whatever. Alright? Turn the lights back on. Alright. So that used up the last action die. Alright. So now we would check for victory conditions, and victory conditions only so when we check for victory conditions at the end of every round, we only check for the military victory conditions. Alright, we check to see if the shadow player has gained 10 points of cities and or strongholds, or of strongholds and or cities. Alright, he hasn't yet. Alright, we check to see if the Free People's player has gained 4 points of cities and or strongholds. The Free People's player has not yet gained that many points. Alright, so neither player wins. Now I know I said before that you would check for the ring conditions, but those don't really come up, because if Frodo gets corrupted to 12 points, he's dead. End of game, shadow player wins. If the ring is destroyed, the step at which the ring is destroyed, then the fellowship player wins. End of story, no more rounds are played. As soon as the ring is destroyed or Frodo gains 12 points of corruption, the game is over. Alright? And the thing that takes precedence over the other is if Frodo gains 12 points of corruption. It doesn't matter if Frodo has 11 points of corruption and destroys the ring and moves because of that or whatever, and then he gets 12 points, it's whatever comes first. The destruction of the ring or 12 points of corruption. There's no ties with that. Alright? So now we would start again by drawing 2 new cards. Alright? So the Free People's player draws 2 new cards. Alright? And the 2 new cards are Horn of Gondor and Through a Day and a Night. Alright? So now if you're following along at home, you know that the Free People's player has 8 cards in their hand. Alright? Now, although they had 6 cards in their hand, they were still allowed to draw the 2 cards at the beginning for the beginning of the round. Alright? But they must discard 2 of these cards. Alright? So I'm going to pick, Paths of the Woses and the Spirit of Mordor. Alright? Just because I want to. Doesn't mean it's a good choice, just because I want to, because I want to keep 6 cards in my hands. Alright? Normally you want to think about these things, because the Free People's player can choose which cards he discards. Alright? So these cards go over to the discard pile, just like before. And the Shadow player gets 2 more cards, Shadows on the Misty Mountains and Cruel Weather. Alright? So now the Shadow player has 5 cards, if you're following along at home. Alright? And then it would be the Fellowship's turn to declare a new leader, but they cannot, because the leader must always be the person with the most points, with the most leadership points. And currently, the companion with the most leadership points is Strider. No one has more than him at all, and no one is tied with him because Gandalf is out. Alright? So, let's talk about a few things. And then, of course, the Free People's player could declare the position of the Fellowship. But seeing as how the Fellowship is on step 1 of the Fellowship track, then it would be pointless to declare, because that means that they are within 0 spaces of the Fellowship's last known position, which is Moria. Alright? The true name for this little figure right here is the Fellowship's last known position. Alright? So, let's talk about a few things. Alright? So, we were talking about these action dice that we've been using throughout the game, right? Alright, so we've been talking about these action dice that we've been using throughout the game, alright? Just to go over a review, alright? We talk about how, both players take all their dice at the end of every round, and they shake them, alright? And the Shadow player is allowed to put in a number of dice of preset eyeball dice, like these, that is equal to or less than the number of companions that are remaining in the Fellowship. Alright? So because there's 6 companions, he could put 6 dice in, but it would be useless because he can only ever roll 5 dice for the fellowship, for the hunt for the fellowship. All right, so that'd be pointless. He could put in 3, he could put in 4, he could put in 5. Don't ever put more than 5 in because you can always roll an extra eyeball dice with the other dice that you're rolling. All right. Alright, so we talked about how, you put those in and we roll the dice, and any other remaining eyeball dice can go in. See, like now it would be 6 dice, but you see that'd be pointless because you can only ever roll 5 dice for the Hunt of the Ring. Alright? We talked about how the fellowship is revealed. The fellowship is revealed when you draw these little tiles right here. We talked about eyeball tiles, which is a damage counter that is equal to the number of successful hunts. So if this was the roll, like the fellowship rolled, the shadow player rolled their hunt, and they got like a 6, 2 6s, a 4, a 2, and a 1, then it would be 2 damage if this was the first time that the fellowship moved. All right. We talked about how the fellowship can move multiple times. Alright? He can move once and twice as long as he is not revealed. The fellowship cannot move when the fellowship is revealed. Alright? If the fellowship is revealed, they have to go back to hidden. We talked about how to do that. We use our character action dice. Alright? We've talked about this. Alright, so let's talk about these individual dice and what they can do. Alright? So but before we get to that, let's talk about the political track. Alright, so if you're following along at home, then you were able to follow how the Isengard nation got to be at war, at the at-war step. We saw how the Sauron nation got to be at war, and we saw how the elves started way up here, but we mustered them once, twice, and 3 times to be at war. Alright, so on the next roll, if the shadow player had 2 muster dice and he didn't want to muster in any units for his nations that were already at war, he could muster in the Southron and Easterling nation, alright? That would be 1 muster die and another muster die. Alright, and he could do that. No other dice allows the player to muster a nation, alright? So let's take a look at the dice real quick, just for the purposes of the political track, alright? So, starting with the shadow player, the eyeball dice, that's self-explanatory. That goes into the little hunt pool before the round starts, alright? Palantirs. The Palantirs are basically card dice, alright? A Palantir allows you to do one of a few things. One, you can draw a card with it, alright? So, remember these cards down here. The strategy deck and the character event deck. If a player so chooses, he can use his Palantir dice, this one or this one, and he can draw a card with those dice. He can draw either card. He can only draw one, and it doesn't matter which one. He could take a character card, he could take an event card, and there's no order to it. Like if he wanted to use 3 Palantir dice and draw 3 character cards in a row, or 3 strategy cards in a row, it wouldn't matter. No difference. Both players can do the same thing. Alright? You'll also notice that on every card, regardless if it's Free People's cards or Shadow Players cards, strategy cards, or character event cards, you'll also notice that in every card, the top left-hand corner of the card has a Palantir on it. Alright? All the time. That means that you can always use a Palantir to play a card. Always, always, always. Alright? You can just always do that. It always works. Both dice have a Palantir symbol on them. Alright? It just always works. Alright? So that's what the Palantir dice do. Palantir sides of the dice do. Alright? We talked about the muster and army dice. Alright? This is basically like either this one or this one. It's like pick which one you want. Alright? This is more of a... It's not, you don't get to use 2 actions, you get to use 1, but you get to choose. So this is a better die roll than, say, just the banner or the muster action. Alright? So with this one, we talked about how we can move armies. Alright? We talked about how you can move armies. So like if the shadow player wanted to, he could use his little army dice, this one, and he could move 1 army once, like that. And he can move another army another time. Like this one. This is an army. Alright? This is also an army. But he moved them all together. Alright? The shadow player could alternatively have said, alright, I'm not going to move this army down here. You know, pretend we didn't do that. Right, like that. Put him back. He said, no, I'm going to split this army. Alright? I'm going to take 2 of them here and 1 of them here. Alright? 1 army. He split the armies. Alright? That's basically what an army dice allows you to do. It allows you to move 2 armies or create 2 armies from 1 army. That's really basically how it works, alright? That simple, alright? I don't see how I could go much more into that, alright? We talked about with battling, though, like say we had this army here and this army here, and we had this army here, alright? We talked about in the battle section how the attacking player has to use an action dice. Well, that's the action dice. Alright? So if it was a shadow player's turn and this was the setup, so you know, some way, somehow the Free People's player made it this far over, then the shadow player would use this dice, right here, and he would start attacking. And you know, we talked about that. Count the number of units there are. He has a combat strength of 4. Combat strength of 4 for the Free People's player. They roll their dice and they attack and they keep going or retreat. We talked about this. Alright? That's what an army dice allows you to do. I don't know the true name of it. I call it banner, army die, whatever you want. Alright? So we talked about that. Then that's about all you can do with the army dice. Alright? It lets you move armies or attack with armies. Alright? So now let's talk about the muster die. It's a crown, if you will. Alright? So we talked about this little crown dice. Alright? With this you can muster. Alright? What does that mean? It means for the shadow player, he never has to worry about getting his nations activated. They start the game activated. Alright? So he can use his muster dice. You know, 1 muster die will move 1 nation down on the political track by 1 step. So you know, 1, 2. 2 steps. If the shadow player wanted to get all his nations to be at war right at the beginning of the game, and he had 1, 2, 3, 4 dice that were muster dice, and he could get all his nations to be at war in the beginning of the game. Alright, so you know, 1 dice, 2 dice, 3 dice, 4 dice. 4 muster actions. You can't use army actions, you can't use any other actions. Alright, only muster actions will let you do that on the political track. Alright? We talked about over here with Isengard how muster dice allow us to recruit units, alright? So let's pretend for a minute that, you know, Saruman was not, you know, in Orthanc, alright? Let's pretend, you know, we just had these. So, you know, if I wanted to do some mustering with just 1 single muster die, and I wanted to just follow normal rules, then I could pick any 2 regions on the map. Well, first of all, if I want to muster in units, then the nation for which I'm mustering in units has to be at war. Alright? That's a rule. So you cannot muster in units for a nation that is not at war. It has to be at war. And it can't be on the political track. They all have to be at war. It doesn't matter if they're activated or not. Cards will let you break certain rules, alright? If a card says to put a elite in a region, or 2 regulars, or a leader, or what have you, then you can do that, because the card says you can. As long as you pay the cost. So, you know, we talked about how the cost is always at least a Palantir. Or it could be a character action die, or a army muster action die, or a banner action die. Doesn't matter. Alright, so say I wanted to do a muster action. Well, for the nation that's at war, so if only the Isengard nation was at war, then I could muster in 2 regulars, if I wanted to. I could put them here, like, you know, 2 here, 1 here, 1 here, or 1 here and 1 here. Basically, I can put 2 in any settlement. Alright? Or I could put an elite in any settlement. Alright? So let's pretend for a minute that all the shadow nations are at war. Alright? All of them are at war. Okay? And let's take a look at Mordor and pretend, you know, it just got emptied. Alright? Let's pretend it just got emptied and I want to do mustering. So, you know, so let's pretend, you know, some way, somehow, forces were emptying out of Mordor and they're going to all parts of the earth to whoop tush. Alright? So if I wanted to strengthen my strongholds, I could use one muster die. I could use a muster die, and I could place 2 regulars, right? I could place a regular here, I could place a regular here, and one here, whatever. I cannot place a regular in Gorgoroth because there's no settlement there, alright? However, there is a settlement in Nirn, down here, which is that little funky red diamond thing. Also indicated by the little village thing. I could muster one there, and one here, or one here, or one here. But there's no settlement in Gorgoroth, so I can't recruit there. Alright? Alternatively, I could muster in an elite here, or here, or here, or here. That's just the way it works. Alright? And there's also one other thing I can do. Alright? So when the leaders come into play, just starting with, the Shadow Players leaders, I could muster in 2 leaders if I wanted to. Alright? I could muster in 1 leader there and 1 leader there. Or 1 leader there and 1 leader there. It doesn't matter. 1 there, or 1 there, 1 there, 1 there. Or I could muster in a leader right down here, and a regular here, or whatever. So basically I could muster in 2 leaders anywhere on the map as long as it's in a shadow stronghold, or I could muster in 2 regulars anywhere on the map as long as they're in their shadow strongholds. Alright? One little rule, Sauron regulars and Sauron elites can only be mustered in Sauron strongholds, which is denoted by the red borders. Alright? Last time I checked, I'm pretty sure that the Nazgul are Sauron units. I'm not 100% sure on that though. You can do checks in your rulebook or whatever, but I always play that Nazgul can only be summoned in to Sauron shadow strongholds and or cities or villages or settlements. Whatever. Alright, so that's how mustering works. Alright? So let's take a look at the muster track again. I mean the political track, because this is really important. Alright, so this is what the game generally looks like. Alright, so generally the 3 nations to be at war first, the 4 nations to be at war first will be the elves and all 3 of the Shadow Players nations. Alright, these nations will still be chilling up here. Alright, so these nations are not yet activated, so the Free People's player cannot yet use a muster action die like this one, or like this one, or even a wild to get these people to move down on the political track. Some cards will let you do that. Some cards will say activate them, and there's some really cool cards that say take this one directly to at war even if it's not activated. Those are really cool cards. You want to work with those, alright? So the whole trick for the Free People's player is to get the nations activated as fast as he possibly can. Alright? So, once the nation's activated, then the Free People's player can start using his muster die to move them down on the track, to get them to be at war, and then he can start mustering in reinforcements. You can see how it's a long-winded process. It kind of reflects the steps at the amount of time and the level of diplomacy that it takes for a whole nation to go to war, especially if the nation is the North nation or the Dwarf nation. It is perfectly normal in some games for some nations to be completely unactivated at all, just because it doesn't work out or just because it doesn't happen. Generally, the Minas Tirith nation gets activated real quickly and goes to war really quickly, and the Rohan nation gets to go to war real quickly because they're neighbors with Isengard. Alright? So you're probably going at home, you're probably going, well, how do I get my nations activated? Because that's really the bread and butter of the game. Once you get your nations activated, the Free People's player can put up a much stronger fight against the Shadow player instead of letting the Shadow player build up a massive army like he was in Isengard just to come in and crush 3 rinky-dink units. Now granted, we talked about how strongholds provide you a superior advantage when you're defending, but still, you want to have elites in there, and it's much better if you have 5 elites going into a shadow stronghold with 5 leaders. That's very preferable. Very hard to break. It might not look like it, but the shadow player has to use lots of dice and lots of units to whittle that force down. Alright? So let's talk about activating nations. Alright? Alright, so let's use Rohan as an example nation for activation. Alright? Alright, so let's talk about how nations get activated. First of all, the shadow player does not have to worry about nations being activated or not activated because his nations all start out activated. Alright? So, in the rulebook we can read that a nation is activated by one of four things. Alright? The first one is this. A region of that nation is entered by an enemy army. Alright? So let's just say that the shadow player used an army dice and moved one army into the Fordzweisen. Alright? We know that the Fordzweisen is inside Rohan because it is outlined with the green border. Alright? So you know this army comes in. Alright? As soon as that happens, regardless if a battle was fought or not, the Free People's player would then activate Rohan. See? Activated. Oh, Minas Tirith isn't activated yet. Alright? So, activated. Now the Free People's player can start using Muster Die to move the Rohan nation down one step at a time on the political track. Alright? But let's say that instead of moving in, alright, like that, let's say that this army that was sitting right here didn't leave, alright? And let's say that, you know, the shadow player used an army dice, like this one, or the army side, that one, doesn't really matter which, and he attacks this nation, alright? And you know, they put up their good fight, and they die in one round, alright? And the shadow player moves in, alright? So then, just by virtue of being attacked, well, let's say they didn't move in, just say they wanted to kill him off, just by virtue of the Isengard nation attacking the Rohan nation, then Rohan would again be activated, alright? By simple virtue of them being attacked, just once, alright? Another thing, that's the second thing that will activate a nation. If it's attacked by an enemy army, be it whatever army, it could be Sauron, it could be Southron and Easterlings, it doesn't matter, it just has to be attacked, alright? The other thing that can do it is if the Fellowship, this thing, somehow ends up in one of the cities or strongholds of that nation. So if the Fellowship somehow lands here, then they are allowed to move, you know. Then the Rohan nation would be activated, alright? Same thing with the city. If the Fellowship somehow made it to the city, then Rohan would be activated, alright? You can only